Shalom, this is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, the virtual rabbi, and welcome to my weekly online Chumash Rashi shir in memory of my dear friend Lenny or Leonard Borgia, Yehuda Leib ben Shmuel. This week we're going to be learning about Parshat Mishpatim, learning various psukim and Rashis and other mafarshim, which I hope you find of interest. Let's begin. We begin, in fact, with the first pasuk of Parshat Mishpatim. Ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. And these are the laws that you shall set before them. On which Rashi says, Ve'ela mishpatim, kol makom shneimar ele pasal al rishonim. Whenever a pasuk begins with the words ele, it means to separate between what was previously said and what's being said now. Whereas ve'ele, with the vav ahead of the word ele, Mosif al rishonim, it adds to what has previously been said. Ma rishonim misinai, af elu misinai, because we just read last week's Parsha Yitro, which tells us about Ma'amad Har Sinai, and so Rashi is informing us that just as the laws, especially the Aseret HaDibrot, were said at Har Sinai, so too all the mitzvot that we're going to be learning about in Parshat Mishpatim, those too were also said at Har Sinai. And then continues Rashi, V'lama nismecha Parshat Dinim le Parshat Mizbeach. The last pasuk of Parshat Yitro refers to the Mizbeach, the altar. So the question is, why are these laws found in Parshat Mishpatim coming immediately after the law about the Mizbeach, the altar? Lomar lecha shetasim Sanhedrin etzel hamikdash. That is to teach you that you should put the Sanhedrin, ultimately the highest court of the land, next to the sanctuary, the word mikdash, although it should be noted that some versions of Rashi say hamizbeach, the altar, where instead of the word hamikdash. We'll come to that right now because we now move on to Rav Moshe Feinstein's insights on Parshat Mishpatim in the Sefer Kol Ram. And here he comments on Rashi's remarks that we've just studied. Pirush Rashi, Lama nismecha Parshat Dinan and Parshat Mizbeach. Rashi notes and says, why are the laws in Parshat Mishpatim coming immediately after the final pasuk in Yitro discussing the altar? Lomar lecha shetasim Sanhedrin etzel hamikdash, to teach you that the highest court of the land, the Sanhedrin, should sit right next to the Mikdash. Sfarim acherim, whereas some other versions of Rashi say lemizbeach, they should sit next to the altar. Of course, the altar was in the Mikdash. Nevertheless, what's the significance of the fact that some people say it should say the word Hamikdash, and others say it should say the word Hamizbeach? Now, ordinarily we kind of say there's no dispute. Some versions say one, some versions say the other. But Rav Moshe Feinstein believes it's telling that both versions have been preserved. He says, I think we can explain these different textual variants in Rashi in the following manner. The members of Sanhedrin, the members of the High Court, had to be holy. They had to behave correctly, as it says in the early psukim in Parshat Yitro. They have to hate corruption, they have to be good people, they have to have the fear of God, they have to be truth-seeking. They don't need to be prepared to give themselves up for the law, they simply need to be holy unto the law. And that's captured in the word mikdash. We learn this from the fact that Sanhedrin needs to be next to the mikdash. And as a result, the members of Sanhedrin too also need to be holy. And according to the second version that we have of Rashi, that the Sanhedrin needs to be next to the Mizbeach, focusing more on the altar than necessarily the entire sanctuary. Because the altar needs to be the ultimate symbol to which the Dayanim turn and see as they reach judgment. And why is this? This is to teach us, we don't just need Dayanim who are holy. We need dayanim who are prepared to give themselves up for the law. That's what is captured in the image of the Mizbeach. He says, that kind of person, they're not easy to find. But you've really got to try and achieve that level. Meaning, the very fact that Rashi uses the words Mikdash and Mizbeach tells us about the dual qualities required of members of the Sanhedrin. Don't just be holy, but be prepared to give yourself up for the law. Be prepared to believe in the law and care for the people to whom you're deciding the law for. What a beautiful explanation of Rav Moshe in Kolram. Let's move on to some further psukim in Parshat Mishpatim. V'gishu Adonav el Elohim v'gishu el adelet ol ha'mezuzah v'ratza Adonav et adzonav b'matzeh v'avdo le'olam. It's talking about the Eved Ivri, and his master shall bring him to the judges, and he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. On this, Rashi asks, why is the Eved Ivri told to have his ear pierced? Why the ear more than any other organ in the body? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, well, this ear heard, do not steal. The reason this person is an Eved is because they stole. And as a result of that, still that person nevertheless went and stole. Therefore, they should have their ear pierced. And if they sold themselves, and why is that a problem? Because you're supposed to be a slave to God. You're supposed to be an Eved Hashem, not an Eved to anybody else. And as a result of having heard that commandment at Har Sinai, by virtue of choosing and finding your own master, they should have their ear pierced. But ask Rav Baruch Mordechai Ezrachi a very simple question. Divrei Chazal tzrichim bi'ur. What Chazal say here in the Rashi are confusing. They require elucidation. Why so? Am Yisrael didn't hear anything more than the Aseret HaDibrot. They only heard the words of Kili b'nei Yisrael afterwards. What he means by this is the following. True, Am Yisrael may well have heard Lo Tignov. They certainly didn't hear at Har Sinai, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. This is a teaching that Moshe would have taught Am Yisrael after the fact. Even though Rashi says in his opening remarks, do you remember the first Rashi that we looked at? It tells us that the entire Torah was given at Sinai. Mikol makom lichora lo shach likra it's not necessarily appropriate to claim that they heard these words at Sinai. Their ears didn't hear this commandment at Har Sinai. Only Moshe heard these words from Moshe, meaning the words of Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. And only afterwards he told Am Yisrael about these verses and these mitzvot. He taught them the Torah. V'itachen, continues Rabbi Ezrachi, and it would appear to be Shamashma'ot ha'amitit shel Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, the true meaning of the first commandment of the Aseret HaDibrot, the true meaning of Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, ze be'etzem machriz al Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. That tells us that we are supposed to choose to be Avdei Hashem. Meaning, true, Am Yisrael didn't hear the exact words, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. They heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And captured in those words is a message of Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. That is to say, that we're supposed to be servants of God. Hainu she'otzeiticha mibet avadim, zuhi be'etzem hamashma'ut shel Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. Klomar, shel Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Thus, what Rabbi Ezrachi basically says is, when Rashi tells us they heard Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, they heard from me the children of Israel are slaves to me, and that's why the Eved Izri has his ear pierced. He didn't actually hear those words. He heard the message in the words of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Ad kan Rav Ezrachi. However, there's a further explanation of this. This comes from Rabbi Billy Rubenstein, who is the Rosh Midrashah of Midreshet Lindenbaum for the Israeli program. She actually has a wonderful longer article for which this is only the first part. and she says something remarkable. The giving of the Torah in Sinai, of which we read in last week's portion of Yitro, is a formative moment in the history of our people. It is a moment when the divine turns to simple man and engages in direct conversation. This unimaginable encounter is translated by the Torah into the Ten Commandments, I should say, or an extraordinary moment. The experience must be translated into actions and put into practice. These are the Ten Commandments. In keeping with the above notion, the portion of Mishpatim translates a divine call to humans into do's and don'ts. And our portion boasts a long list of mitzvot, most of which pertain to interpersonal relationships, meaning Parshat Mishpatim, i.e. laws between people, bein Adam lachavero, which aim to formalize social behaviors and norms in various areas of life. This broad spectrum of mitzvot incorporates a great many life situations, and in this ocean of mitzvot, what a beautiful turn of phrase, relating to daily life, the grandeur of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah of Mount Sinai, seems to fade somewhat. You have this amazing moment of Matan Torah, and then you have these very concrete, seemingly mundane laws in Parshat Mishpatim. In the following paragraph, she says, I'd like to illustrate how the splendor and majesty of Matan Torah at Sinai is nonetheless able to penetrate the seemingly dry description of Parshat Mishpatim, meaning when we look closely at the psukim of Parshat Mishpatim, we see the grandeur of Parshat Yitro. And now she actually alludes to the same idea noted by Rav Ezrachi. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. She says, the first commandment is a basis for everything that was before and all that is still to happen. The Torah wishes to teach us that the notion of I am the Lord your God must be applied to all layers of society, the lowest ranks included. The reason being that a person's true awareness of the commandment I am the Lord your God can only be judged by the way he treats his own slave or maidservant. The way we demonstrate that we understand Anochim Hashem Elokecha is how we treat those who serve us. The exodus from Egypt marked the end of the slavery period for the Israelites, and the Ten Commandments place this recognition at the very basis of the encounter between man and God. Parshat Mishpatim takes this further and demands of us to apply this awareness practically and to live by it, thus putting into action the principles stating that an Israelite is only a slave to God and no one else. So we have here really a very similar idea to what Rabbi says, that alluded into the first of the Aseret Dibot, Anochim Hashem Elokecha, is the idea of treating all people right, which is why there's a connection between the Eved Ivri and that commandment. We move on, and we have three psukim, one after the other in Parshat Mishpatim, which are of interest. One who strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a man and sells him, found in his possession, that person should surely be put to death. So you have, the first is a commandment against striking, hitting a parent. The second is a prohibition against kidnapping somebody. And the third is a prohibition against cursing a parent. And Rav Shimon Schwab asks a very simple question. It seems to be that Pasuk Tet Zayin is out of place. You have two psukim about parents, and in between is a statement about kidnapping. And he says here something really quite wonderful. The fact that in between the prohibition of hitting a parent and cursing a parent, there's the prohibition against kidnapping somebody. We're not trying to make any kind of legal comparison per se. He says, I think is the following. How could somebody come to a point that actually hit or curse a parent? It's unimaginable. However, Chazal have already told us, meaning it's a Gemara in Kiddushin that tells us, while your hand is still on your son's neck, that a parent has a duty to be involved in the raising of their child in an active manner. As long as the child is basically living under their roof, they are under their rule. And they say that means up to 22 or 24, etc. But then he goes on to say, the truth is, after that point in time, a child is not going to receive the parent's rebuke. And that means from then on, a parent shouldn't try and be controlling of their child. ואם שולטים על הבן כאילו הוא עבד לבניו, ואמו מעבידים אותו בעבודתם, מטילים עליו פחד ואימה, אז נחשב כאילו גנב נפש מישראל. He says, if you try and control your child when they should feel like they are an independent adult, then it's like you're kidnapping them. You're taking away their free will. שאין לו הבן חירות, ובזה מסיתים מרידת הבן עד כדי הכרה וכללה. In fact, ultimately, you are leading a child to have contempt for a parent, such that they may then lead to hitting a parent or cursing a parent. While זה בא הרמז בפסוק, and as a result of this, the verse tells us, וגונב נפש, about kidnapping a person, ben makelel makelel, between the law of hitting a parent and cursing a parent, for us to realize that when you take away the free will of a child, this can be a reason why a child then rebels back. Just for you to know, Rabbi Pesach Krohn quotes this teaching of Rabbi Shimon Schwab, and he explains it in a really, really beautiful way. He says this in a book, The Maggid at the Podium. Rav Schwab explains that this is a warning to parents not to treat their children like kidnapped hostages, constantly breathing down their necks, stifling their initiative, suppressing or ridiculing their youthful plans and aspirations. Parents who act like slave drivers might one day trigger an open rebellion with disastrous results. How true. Let us move on. We are told the following. Im chavol tachbol salmat re'echa ad ba hashemesh tashivenu lo, ki hi ksuto, לבדו היא שמלתו לאורו במה ישכב, והיה כי יצעק אלי ושמעתי חנונני. If you take your neighbor's garment as collateral, turn it to him before the sun sets. Because it is his only clothing, the sole covering for his skin. What else does he have with which to sleep? If he cries out to me, I'll be listening, for I am compassionate. You shall not curse a judge, neither shall you deride a prince among your people. On this, Rabbi Sachs says something so majestic. He says, this is law with a human face. Superficially, we're dealing with a simple economic transaction. Someone borrows money and gives a lender an item of clothing as security for the repayment of the loan, an everyday occurrence in ancient times. Yet the Torah insists that we must not forget the existential human situation. The borrower may be poor, the cloak may be the only one he has. The lender must not forget this fact. In strict legal terms, he may be within his right simply to hold on to the pledge, but a decent society depends on more than legal rights. The Torah adds, by way of justification, God himself says about the poor borrower, when he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. God, the lawgiver, is not a remote abstraction. He is a direct, personal presence in the lives of those who keep his law. And just as God tempers justice with compassion, so must his people do likewise. And then continues Rabbi Sachs the following. Note how the Torah teaches this principle. It does it by specific example. It doesn't just simply say, be compassionate. It gives us one example of what this may mean in daily life, and there are many others as well, and he goes on to teach us. Ultimately, as Rabbi Sachs concludes here, therefore the Torah gives us general rules on the one hand, examples on the other, so we're able to see both the broad picture and some of the brushstrokes out of which it is made. God is not only in generalities, he is also in the details. What a beautiful way to understand this prohibition or this law. We come to our final pasuk. You shall not accept a bribe. This is a prohibition specifically to judges, although of course it applies to others as well, for a bribe will blind the clear-sighted and corrupt words that are right. Interestingly, the Gemara in Masechet Ketubot says, "My shochad, shehu chad." What does the word shochad mean? It means as one. The word chad means one. So what does shochad means? It means becoming as one, on which Rashi on the Gemara says, who becomes one? Shehu chad, hanoten v'makabel nasim lev echad. The giver of the bribe and the receiver of the bribe become as one, which makes sense. Somebody gives a bribe and someone receives. They become now, a unit, and they're like chad. But on this, Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein in his Tosefet Bracha says something really fascinating. He says, I previously mentioned how the word shochad comes from the words shehu chad. Appears Rashi, and Rashi then the Gemara says that Kavana Shu Noten Makabel Nasim Levechad, that the giver and the receiver become like one heart. Ad kan lashona. V'omnam lefi biur zeh hayat tzarich liot hagirsa b'Gemara shehem echad. The problem is, according to that reasoning, the Gemara should have said my shachad shehem echad. What is shachad? Because they are like one. But it says because he is like one. And this leads Rabbi Epstein to say something really, really beautiful. Al derech drash agadi efshar lefaresh lashon shehu chad. He says, I'd like to suggest an alternative way of explaining this word. That the word shehu chad, which is the wording of the Gemara, that he is one, musav ala dayan, that refers to a judge, levado, exclusively. And the meaning is based on the Gemara in Shabbat. Kol dayan shu dan din emet lamito, kil naseh shutaf lakadosh baruch hu ma'aseh bereshit. There's a beautiful teaching in the Gemara Shabbos that whichever judge judges with truth and does so with an endeavor to find, reach, and rule according to the truth, they become like a partner with God in the making of creation. Because both God established the world on truth, and this judge is trying to establish his ruling on truth. But this only applies to a judge who judges truthfully. When that happens, they become a partner with God. But a judge who takes a bribe, but somebody who takes a bribe and therefore decides a law according to the person who's given them a bribe, they're no longer a partner with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and that judge is alone. The difference between a true judge and a judge who takes bribes, a true judge is working with God. A judge who takes bribes is standing there alone. He's not working with God. He's in it for himself. Let's quickly review what we've done. We began with the first pasuk of Parshat Mishpatim, and we learned from here that the Dayanim in the Sanhedrin, and the truth is it would apply to Dayanim even today, they need not just to be holy, but they also need to be prepared to literally put themselves on the altar of the law which they are deciding. We then learned the question of how come that the Eved Ivri, their ear is pierced. According to Chazal, because they heard Lo Tignov, they also heard Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim. Asked Rabbi Ezrachi, how can that be the case? They didn't hear that pasuk straight from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, but they heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Rabbi Billy Rebenstein basically says the same idea, that really from Anochi Hashem Elokecha we learn how to treat all people, especially Avadim. How come, asked Rav Schwab, we have 3 psukim, and embedded between the law of prohibiting hitting a parent and cursing a parent is a law against kidnapping somebody? And he explains by saying sometimes a child who feels that they've been kidnapped, that their freedom is taken away from them, they're being muffled, right? Then they want to lash out to their parents. Parents should be careful about that. We're taught about the pasuk, if you take away the clothes of another as a collateral, make sure you give them back, because this is their dignity. Says Rabbi Sachs, this teaches us what it means to be compassionate. It teaches us also how law is taught in the Torah. We ended with an explanation of the word shochad, shuhu chad. It's not just that they together are one, but that person is no longer with God as a partner in creation. I hope you enjoyed this shiur. Don't forget to check out other shiurim of mine on my YouTube channel. You can also find other Divrei Torah, including my Daf Yomi insights on my website, rabbijohnnysolomon.com, and there you can also book for spiritual coaching, halachic consultations, and one-to-one learning. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.